The most feared warship on Earth was brought to its knees by an aircraft that belonged in a museum. Not a jet. Not a dive bomber screaming out of the sun. A biplane. Fabric stretched over wooden ribs. An open cockpit. Two wings held together with wire. A machine so slow the men who flew it joked you could climb out and walk faster. Picture the German gunners on the deck of the Bismarck. It is late May 1941. They have just sunk the pride of the Royal Navy. 50,000 tons of steel under their boots. The most advanced battleship ever built. They feel untouchable. Because they are. Then a lookout points at the sky. Something is crawling toward them out of the storm. The gunners squint through the rain. And for a moment, they laugh. Because what they see is ridiculous. A handful of little biplanes, wobbling in the wind like paper toys, so slow it barely seems worth the effort to aim. The gunners have been trained to shoot down fast, modern aircraft. But this thing isn't racing, it's limping. The laughter dies fast. Because that limping little relic is about to do what no shell, no torpedo, no warship in the entire Royal Navy could do. It is about to reach out and cripple the unsinkable Bismarck. This is the story of the aircraft everyone wanted to scrap, and how, in one impossible strike, it changed the fate of the war at sea. To understand the miracle, you have to understand the fear. In the spring of 1941, Britain was losing the war in the Atlantic. Slowly, quietly, and it was starving to death. Britain is an island. Everything comes by sea. The food, the fuel, the bullets. Every loaf and drop of oil crossed thousands of miles of open ocean in slow, crowded convoys, and Germany was hunting those convoys like wolves. Then came the Bismarck. She was not just another warship. She was a monster, nearly the length of 3 football pitches. Armor so thick that shells were designed to bounce off it. Guns that could hurl a shell the weight of a small car over 20 miles and drop it straight down a chimney. If she broke out into the Atlantic, she could shred entire convoys on her own. She could cut the lifeline. She could bring Britain to its knees. So, on the 24th of May, the Royal Navy sent its own giant to stop her. HMS Hood, the most famous warship in the world. The symbol of British sea power for 20 years. The two titans met in the freezing waters off Greenland. The battle lasted minutes. A German shell found a weakness in the hood. There was a deep, hollow thump. A pause, and then the pride of the Royal Navy was simply gone. 1,400 men were aboard. 3 survived. Let that number sit for a moment. 3. Britain was in shock. The Bismarck barely had a scratch. And now she vanished into the gray Atlantic mist, running for the coast of occupied France, where she could hide, repair, and come back for more. The Royal Navy threw everything it had into the chase. Dozens of ships. Every gun they owned. And they lost her. For hours, nobody knew where the Bismarck was. The most dangerous ship in the world had disappeared. And every hour she stayed hidden brought her closer to safety and Britain closer to disaster. The big guns had failed. The mighty Hood had failed. The only thing that could save Britain now was the thing nobody took seriously. Let me introduce you to the joke of the Royal Navy. The Fairey Swordfish. By 1941, it was already a fossil. Aircraft design was rocketing forward. Sleek monoplanes with enclosed cockpits and retractable wheels were tearing across the sky at hundreds of miles an hour. And the Swordfish? It looked like it had flown straight out of the First World War. A biplane when everyone else had moved on. Wings covered in doped fabric you could put your fist through. Fixed wheels that hung down in the wind. An open cockpit, so the crew flew straight into the freezing spray. No roof, no shelter, just goggles and a scarf and raw nerve. Top speed? Around 130 miles an hour. Downhill, with a good wind. Loaded with a torpedo, in an attack, it crawled in at less than 90. The men gave it a nickname. The Stringbag. Because like an old shopping bag, it seemed to carry any strange load you crammed into it, held together with string and hope. The high command was almost embarrassed by it. This was the age of the battleship, of enormous guns and thick armor. The admirals had grown up worshipping the big gun. To them, aircraft were a novelty, A scout at best. A toy. The idea that a cloth and wire biplane could threaten a steel giant like the Bismarck? It was laughable, beneath serious discussion. But the men who actually flew the Swordfish knew a secret. They knew that being slow and old wasn't only a weakness. In the right hands, it was a strange kind of armor. These were the crews of the Fleet Air Arm. Young men, many barely out of their teens, flying off the pitching decks of carriers in the worst weather the Atlantic could throw at them. They weren't glamorous. They didn't get the headlines. They flew a machine the rest of the Navy quietly wanted to scrap. They were the underdogs of the underdogs. And now, with the Bismarck slipping towards safety and every modern weapon failing, the fate of the hunt was about to land on the shoulders of the men in the funny little biplane, the aircraft that time had left behind. Here is where it gets almost too strange to believe. The very thing that made the Swordfish a joke was about to make it deadly. Think about how you shoot down a plane. You can't aim where it is. By the time your shell arrives, it's moved. So you have to aim ahead. You lead the target, like a hunter swinging past a flying bird. The Bismarck's anti-aircraft guns were among the finest in the world. Fast, accurate, backed by clever machines that calculated exactly where a modern attacker would be by the time the shells got there. But those machines had a built-in assumption. They expected the enemy to be fast. And the Swordfish was absurdly slow. The gunners set up their shots to lead a quick, modern aircraft. The shells screamed out and burst far ahead of the crawling biplane. The Stringbags simply hadn't arrived yet. It was still plodding along, way back behind where the deadly explosions were blooming in the sky. How do you aim at something that seems to hang in the air? Something moving so slowly it broke every instinct they'd been trained on? There was more. That flimsy fabric body? Cannon shells sometimes punched clean through it without exploding. Nothing solid enough to trigger them. The plane just kept flying, a little more ragged, wind whistling through fresh holes. Then, there was the flying itself. The final strike launched in weather so wild it should have been suicide. The carrier's flight deck was heaving up and down through 50 feet or more. Rain lashed sideways. The sea was a gray chaos of foam. Modern aircraft couldn't have taken off in that. Too fast, too fragile, too fussy. But the Swordfish? It was so slow and so sturdy, it could stagger off a pitching deck that would have wrecked anything else, fly low under the cloud, and come in at a walking pace. The men climbed into their open cockpits. No roof over their heads. The freezing spray needling their faces. Every one of them knew exactly what they were flying toward. The most heavily armed warship on the planet. In a biplane made of cloth. The oldest, slowest, most mocked aircraft in the fleet, sent to do what the mightiest guns in the Navy could not. It should have been a punchline. It was about to become a legend. The attack came at dusk on the 26th of May. Picture it from the German deck. The light is failing. The sea is a mess of whitecaps. And out of the low gray cloud, they come. Not fast, not all at once. That's what makes it worse. The Swordfish don't scream in and vanish. They emerge from the murk one by one, dropping low, lining up their slow, deliberate runs. There's an awful patience to it. Like watching a storm you can't outrun. The air erupts. Every gun the Bismarck has opens up. The sky fills with black smoke and fire, and a wall of steel, a continuous hammering roar. And the little biplanes fly straight into it. They drop down to the wave tops. This is the terrifying part of a torpedo run. To hit a ship, you have to fly dead level, dead straight, right at the enemy, holding your line while every gun in the world is aimed at your face. You cannot dodge. You cannot weave. You commit. And you pray. One by one, the Stringbags bore in through the storm of fire. Wind screaming through the wires. The pilots hunched forward, eyes locked on that vast gray hull growing bigger and bigger. And then, at the last possible second, they release. The torpedoes drop into the sea and begin their run. Long white lines racing through the black water toward the Bismarck. The great ship heaves. She turns. She twists that enormous body, throwing up a wall of spray, dodging the deadly trails. One misses. Another, The German crew must have felt a surge of hope. They were beating the toys. And then, one torpedo did not miss. It struck the Bismarck at the worst possible place, right at the very back of the ship. The stern. The rudders. For the men flying home through the dark, it looked like just another hit. They couldn't have known. They limped back to their carrier, frozen, exhausted, some of their aircraft riddled with holes, and reported one hit near the stern. It didn't sound like much. It was everything. Because a ship steers with its rudder. And that single torpedo had jammed the Bismarck's rudder hard over, locked, stuck fast. The most powerful battleship in the world could no longer steer. She could not run for France. She could not choose her course. Her engine still roared at full power, but she could only turn helpless circles in the sea, dragged around and around by a jammed rudder, going nowhere. And every circle brought the pursuing Royal Navy closer. Word spread through the Bismarck like ice water. The mood on that ship flipped in an instant, from hunters to hunted, from untouchable to trapped. They had laughed at the biplanes, and the biplanes had nailed them to the spot. The unsinkable Bismarck had been crippled by a joke. Now hold that image. The Bismarck turning helpless circles because the men in the mocked biplanes refused to be a punchline. Because there is a darker side to this story. A lesson written in the cost of arrogance. Remember HMS Hood. The Hood was the temple of the big gun. She was everything the old admirals believed in. Huge, beautiful, bristling with cannon. She was the answer to the question, what wins wars at sea? And for 20 years that answer had been simple. The biggest guns on the biggest ship. That belief cost 1,400 lives in the space of a few minutes. The old thinking said air power was a sideshow, that a ship's fate was decided by armor and artillery, gun against gun, giant against giant, that the funny little swordfish was, at best, useful for spotting. The Hood went to trade blows with a monster, gun for gun, exactly the way the doctrine demanded. And she was gone before most of Britain had finished breakfast. There's a bitter truth in these two scenes, side by side. The mighty gun, worshipped for a generation, was smashed in minutes, and the obsolete, mocked, almost scrapped biplane did what all that steel and all those guns could not. There's an even sharper edge to the tale. On the very first strike, before the famous one, a wave of swordfish launched in poor visibility and mistakenly attacked one of their own ships. A British cruiser, hidden in the murk, a terrifying near disaster. But something strange saved the day. The torpedoes they'd been given that time had faulty detonators. They failed. Not one struck home. So the crews went back, armed with different, more reliable torpedoes, and it was those that flew on the second decisive strike. The strike that jammed the rudder. A mistake. A malfunction. A second chance. Had those first torpedoes worked, they'd have destroyed a friend. Had they not been swapped for the strike that mattered, the Bismarck might have reached France. That is how close it came. That is how much rested on the shoulders of an aircraft the High Command had wanted to throw away. The men who believed in the big gun learned their lesson in blood. The men who believed in the mocked little biplane changed the war at sea forever. By the next morning, it was over. The Royal Navy caught the crippled Bismarck as she circled, unable to flee, and closed in. The monster that had terrified an empire was finished. The hunt was done. And it was done because of the Stringbag. Think about the men who flew it. Boys, really, frozen in open cockpits. Flying a machine the rest of the Navy was embarrassed by, straight into the guns of the most dangerous ship afloat. No speed, no armor, no respect. Just a slow, stubborn little biplane, and the nerve to fly it all the way in. The swordfish was never supposed to matter. It was a relic, a joke told in the officers' mess. The future belonged to sleek, fast, modern machines. And in a way, it did. But on that dark and violent night, it was the past that saved the future. The slow that caught the fast. The mocked that humbled the mighty. Go back to the very beginning. Go back to those German gunners on the deck, feeling untouchable, watching something crawl toward them out of the storm. Remember how they laughed. Remember those few seconds of easy, confident laughter? At the paper toy in the sky. At the fabric and wire relic that couldn't possibly matter. Those few seconds of laughter were the last easy moment the crew of the Bismarck would ever have. Because the joke of the Royal Navy had just written its name into history in the wreck of the greatest battleship the world had ever seen.